A girl went out for a walk and disappeared under strange circumstances. What happened next could rival any crime thriller, as no one could have anticipated such a series of unexpected twists and shocking revelations. This case became one of the most perplexing in history, but in the end, the detectives managed to uncover the truth. Christy Lynn Mullins was born on August 28, 1960, in the American city of Columbus, Ohio. She grew up in a very large family. Her parents had 5 children. They all lived in a quiet residential neighborhood, far from the hustle and bustle of the city. During the summer of 1975, when Christy was 14, she spent most of her time walking around with friends or with her sisters. They especially enjoyed going to the public pool, located in a residential complex not far from Christy's home. The girl also occasionally worked as a babysitter, looking after young children. On August 26th, a familiar woman asked Christy to watch a child until late in the evening. The next day, the girl woke up around noon and started thinking about how to pass the time until her birthday. There were only 5 days left, and she was eagerly anticipating the event. The day was very hot, with the temperature reaching 34 degrees, so Christy, without much thought, decided that the best choice would be to go to the pool. She took her sister, Kim, who was a year younger than her, and the girls headed to the residential complex. Kim went swimming immediately, while her sister stayed on a lounge chair. A few minutes later, she saw one of Christy's friends approach her. They talked about something and then left. Kim was surprised that her sister left her alone, without saying anything, but decided not to follow her and stayed at the pool. Sometime later, Kim returned home, but her sister was not there. A few hours later, she started to worry because Christy hadn't even come home for lunch. The girl decided to walk around the streets to look for her sister, and she soon ran into one of the neighbors. The girl's body was found a few kilometers away, but they couldn't establish her identity. Kim ran home and told her parents, who immediately called the police and explained that they couldn't find their daughter. They were called to the morgue and saw the body of the deceased girl, but at first the parents couldn't tell if it was really their daughter. The problem was that the face of the deceased was so covered in bruises and contusions that it was initially impossible to identify her. However, the mother later noticed a birthmark on the girl's leg and realized it was Christy. After confirming her identity, the police informed the shocked family about what had happened. Around 3:30 in the morning, at 911, they received a call from a man who said he had found a human body in a wooded area behind a shopping center. He, his wife, and their son had gone there to buy toys for their daughter. Before the family reached the shopping center, their son said he wanted to walk through the wooded area behind the building. Among the trees, there was a path that all the locals knew well. It led to a river, and overall it was a rather picturesque spot, so people often went there for a walk. The parents agreed and took that path into the woods. Sometime later, as the family was returning, they suddenly noticed something strange a few dozen meters from the path. Upon closer inspection, they saw a man leaning over someone on the ground, hitting them with a piece of wood. This man noticed he was being watched and ran off. After that, the father approached and discovered a girl covered in blood on the ground. His wife, who had some medical training, tried to find the victim's pulse, but couldn't feel it. Since there were no mobile phones at that time, the man immediately ran to the shopping center and called the police from there. They provided investigators with a description of the perpetrator. He was a tall, slim young man of about 20 years old, with long, dark hair down to his shoulders. He was only wearing denim shorts and boots. Based on these testimonies, the police created a rough sketch of the suspect and sent it out to the patrols. Examining the crime scene didn't yield much. They found the piece of wood used as the murder weapon, but no other clues that could lead them to the criminal. It is worth noting that the victim's hands were tied with a telephone cord, and the top of her swimsuit was pulled down. The t-shirt she was wearing that day was found next to her body, as well as her boots. Despite this, medical experts found no evidence of sexual assault. Investigators speculated that the criminal intended to sexually assault her, but was scared off. Despite the lack of clues, the police quickly figured out which direction to investigate. Christie's sister mentioned that the girl had left the pool with her friend Carol, so the police went to talk to her. Carol said that day, a strange man, claiming to be a DJ from a local radio station, had called her home. He said that cheerleading competitions would be held in their town, and that the winners would receive free tickets to the state fair. The caller stated that the event would take place behind the shopping center, starting at 1:45 p.m. He told her to wait at the entrance to the path in the woods, where someone would meet her and explain everything. This story seemed very suspicious to the police, but even more strange things were yet to come. She waited for some time, but no one came, and eventually, the girl left. The police found no evidence that a cheerleading competition was scheduled in the town. They suspected that the caller could have been the murderer trying to lure Carol into the woods, or it was just a prank unrelated to the murder. In any case, they couldn't trace the call, making it impossible to identify the caller. Moreover, the investigators noticed a discrepancy in Carol's story. She said she had met Christie and her sister on the street while she was heading to the shopping center. However, Christie's mother claimed they were at the pool. Carol had joined them there, but that wasn't all. Later that evening, Christie's mother ran into Carol, who lived just a few dozen meters from their house, and they had a very strange conversation. Carol began apologizing to the woman, saying that things shouldn't have gone so far. The girl added that she was supposed to be the victim and that 2 people were involved in the murder. Christie's mother tried to get more details, but Carol refused to continue the conversation and left. The woman reported this to the police, who questioned Carol again, but the girl denied saying any of that and insisted on the truthfulness of her original version. Eventually, she was interrogated with a lie detector, and the operator detected no signs of lying on the key questions. After that, the investigators stopped focusing on Carol and continued pursuing other leads. In the days that followed, as the news of the brutal murder spread throughout the region, the local residents were gripped by massive fear. They understood that a dangerous criminal was still at large. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that the police believed the murderer was someone from the area, since he knew the path behind the shopping center. The detectives put all their efforts into finding the culprit, and a few days later, after the long-awaited breakthrough, around 5:00 p.m., a patrolling officer spotted a young man resembling the sketch of Christie's murderer. The officer immediately contacted the detectives, who quickly arrived on the scene. They asked the man to voluntarily accompany them to the police station to answer a few questions, and he agreed. During the interrogation, the police immediately encountered a problem. The man suffered from a serious mental disability. His IQ was estimated to be around 50 points, according to various tests. Jack was under the care of a specialized medical facility and lived in an apartment provided by a non-profit organization where he worked. He couldn't read or write and had difficulty speaking. However, the detectives working on Christie's case couldn't overlook the man's resemblance to the sketch. The interrogation was very challenging. Most of the time, Jack responded to the investigators' questions with just one word or didn't say anything at all. They also began to doubt whether he could fully understand and grasp the meaning of their questions. Ultimately, this went on for 6 hours, but the detectives eventually found something. By asking the simplest and most concrete questions possible, they managed to get the long-awaited confession from Jack. The man also provided investigators with details that only the criminal could know, such as the fact that the piece of wood had broken in two when he hit the victim with it. Additionally, witnesses were identified, including Carol, who could recognize the man they had seen that day. Both of them unequivocally identified Jack. Eventually, the man was charged with several counts, including sexual assault. Although the experts had found no evidence of sexual assault, Jack confessed to this as well. As a result, the charge was not dropped. The prosecutor decided to seek the death penalty. However, with Jack's agreement, his lawyer negotiated a life sentence instead of execution. Given that thousands of people were following this case, everything happened very quickly. By September 3rd, just 11 days after the murder, Jack was sentenced to life in prison. However, even this brief trial was enough for many people to start doubting Jack's guilt. The more details about his confession and the man himself emerged in the media, the more people who knew Jack didn't believe it. According to them, the man had never shown any signs of aggression. On the contrary, he was very passive, fearful, and easily manipulated. He could have said any lie if it was demanded of him harshly enough. For example, once at the charity center, he took responsibility for a broken water heater, even though someone else had caused the damage. Significant doubts were also raised about Jack's ability to physically confess to the crime. The man could barely speak, yet the police claimed he had revealed all the details of his act. Those who knew Jack suspected that the investigators had simply provided him with all the necessary information. They only needed to ask leading questions that already contained facts about the case, such as asking if he had struck the victim with a piece of wood. If Jack answered yes, the police could already use that as a confession. A woman involved in his care added that under threat, he could have confessed to anything. It was enough to tell him he was at risk of the electric chair for him to do whatever was asked of him. But that's not all. Supporters of Jack's innocence discovered that the police had brought him to the crime scene at the same time as the witnesses, a married couple who later identified him, among others, at the police station. Thus, they had already seen Jack and knew he was the suspect. The police themselves claimed that the witnesses hadn't crossed paths with Jack, but no one believed them. There were still many other factors that raised serious doubts. For example, the police couldn't find the bus driver or even a single passenger who had seen Jack shirtless on his way downtown. According to his own confession, that's how he had traveled home. The most significant factor was the testimony of several people who were in the building of the charitable organization where Jack lived and worked. They stated they had seen the man around 1:30 p.m. If he was really there, he had absolutely no way of catching a bus to the suburban shopping center and committing the murder at 1:50 p.m. Even if he had left right after being seen by the witnesses, the bus took at least 40 minutes to cover that distance. All these facts led many people not only to doubt Jack's guilt, but also to conclude that the police had fabricated the case and to demand a thorough investigation. Following this, they formed a public committee with the goal of seeking justice. As a result, Jack obtained a new lawyer who immediately filed a request to reopen the case. A few months later, The judge dismissed Jack's confession and ordered a new trial. Now the prosecution had to prove his guilt from scratch, which seemed like an almost impossible task. While preparations for the new trial were underway, Christie's father, Norman Mullins, conducted his own investigation. From the beginning, he distrusted the detectives and believed they were not doing their job properly and were not trying to find his daughter's real killer. He finally decided not to rely on the police and to search for answers himself. Shortly after the murder, he went into those woods with some neighbors to inspect them. There he discovered a pair of jean shorts, and his acquaintances found blood-stained men's underwear. They handed these pieces of evidence over to the police, who initially had simply missed them. However, it remained unknown if they were included in the case. Jack's new trial didn't begin until 2 years after the murder. The defense had two objectives. The first and main one was to prove Jack's innocence, and the second was to try to identify the real killer. They considered Henry Newell, the man who had found Christie's body with his wife, as the most likely suspect. At the time of the murder, he was 25 years old. Before the trial began, Jack's lawyers had compiled an impressive list of reasons to suspect Henry of the murder. And during the trial, even more emerged. The fact that Henry was a hardened criminal drew attention. Since his teenage years, he had been arrested many times for various crimes, ranging from minor to major offenses. He had been imprisoned 3 times and had successfully escaped twice before being recaptured and sent back to prison. At the time of Jack's trial, he was serving his 4th sentence, this time for burning down his own house to collect insurance money. The lawyers also reviewed the records of Christie's case and found several very suspicious details in Henry's statements. He said he had discovered her body, approached it, and pushed aside the blood-stained piece of wood. He explained this by saying that he was in a state of shock at the time. However, such an action seems strange, taking the murder weapon in his hands and tossing it away from the body without any apparent reason. Secondly, he claimed it seemed to him that the girl was still alive, which is why he removed his t-shirt and placed it over the victim's face. This action also raised questions. Was the man really trying to stop the bleeding, or had his t-shirt been soaked in blood during the murder, and did he need an excuse? Jack's lawyers found an employee of the shopping center where Henry had rushed to call the police. She mentioned that he wasn't wearing a t-shirt, but rather jean shorts, although he was already wearing different pants by the time the police arrived. Additionally, the woman noted that Henry had a bruise, as if someone had hit him. When asked why she hadn't reported this to the police immediately, she replied that no one had asked her to. At the same time, the police themselves should have obviously noticed the bruise, but they ignored it. It's worth noting that initially, Henry even agreed to be questioned using a lie detector, but he ended up vomiting on the machine, and the police didn't arrange a second interrogation. Henry claimed that on the night of the murder, he spoke to his neighbor and saw numerous fresh scratches on his hands. The man added that he had seen in Henry's garage a telephone wire of the same color and shape as the one used to bind the victim's hands. But that's not all. A neighbor stated that Henry had told him a very strange story. The man had seen him chasing his naked girlfriend. Given that he was 25 years old at the time, this story stunned everyone involved in the case. For obvious reasons, it wasn't possible to find direct confirmation of this story. However, it was mentioned that Henry knew Carol, who was also directly involved in the case. His wife also spoke during the trial. She stated that everything happened exactly as they had told the police on the first day. She, her husband, and their son went to the mall. The son wanted to take a walk, and they found the body in the woods. The woman added that until then, Henry had stayed at home and had only gone out for a few minutes to chase away the neighborhood children who had started throwing firecrackers in their yard. Carol also answered the lawyer's questions. The first thing she stated was that she never knew Henry. She was also asked what she meant in her conversation with the victim's mother when she said she didn't remember saying anything of the sort. Henry himself was brought into the courtroom directly from prison. He repeated his story without any changes and insisted that he had nothing to do with the crime. One of the most striking moments of the trial was the showing of the full transcript of Jack's interrogation, after which it was highlighted that he had committed the murder. Jack barely spoke and apparently didn't understand what the police wanted him to say, but that wasn't the main focus of the trial. On the fifth day, another witness appeared, one whom neither the prosecution nor Jack's lawyers had expected. This was Bobby, Henry's adopted son. His story truly shocked everyone following the case. The boy stated that Henry had left the house that day to chase away children who were throwing firecrackers into their yard. However, his absence lasted not just a few minutes, as his mother said, but over half an hour. When the man returned home, he no longer had his t-shirt or sandals, and his hands and face were covered in scratches. Henry called Pam him into another room, where they talked about something. They then came out and told Bobby that they would all go to the mall together. When they arrived, his parents immediately took him to the trail behind the mall. The boy clarified that he hadn't asked to go there, as his parents had initially claimed. They walked into the woods and almost immediately found Henry's sandals, one of which was torn. Further on, they saw Christie's body, and his mother told Bobby never to tell anyone what he had seen. The boy added that he only decided to tell the truth after discussing it with his own father. His grandmother also spoke at the trial and recounted an episode related to Henry. She had accompanied him and Pam to a forgiveness ceremony with Christie. On the way back, the woman said there had been a terrible tragedy, to which Henry suddenly responded that it would teach her to keep quiet. Another witness was a friend of Henry's. He said that Henry had once confessed to him that he had killed Ree, but that it was an accident and hadn't been planned. In the end, the trial left no doubt that Jack had nothing to do with the crime, and he was finally cleared of all charges against him. But that's when things started to go wrong. Despite the overwhelming evidence pointing to Henry's involvement, the prosecutor announced that he had no intention of pursuing the case against him. He also stated that the initial investigation had been conducted in the best possible way, omitting the fact that the police had neglected or ignored the many leads and evidence they had since the first day. His response sparked a wave of public outrage. It grew to such proportions that 2 days later, the prosecutor was forced to retract his statements and agreed to reopen the investigation into Christie's case. But again, problems arose with the investigators who relied on the initial investigation, including Henry and Pam's testimony. In other words, the police officers continued to operate under the assumption that they had stumbled upon Christie's body in the woods, with the hair of a shirtless man above her. That's why the investigators stated that they would search for new suspects resembling Jack. After that, the investigation finally stalled. Christie's father never gave up on seeking justice. At one point, he filed a civil lawsuit against Jack, but the reasons for such a move were not clear. The man didn't believe in Jack's involvement in the murder. However, this lawsuit would have allowed him to access the case file and study it. Unfortunately, this effort also yielded no results. In 2000, Christie's father passed away from cancer, but the case remained unresolved. For a long time, the investigation into Christie's murder didn't progress until a former lawyer, John O'Leary, took an interest in the case in 2013. During his investigation, he discovered that Laurel, the victim's friend at the time, was smoking marijuana. Delving deeper, he uncovered something else and concluded that she, like other teenagers, had apparently bought marijuana from Henry. This was another connection between him and Laurel, which could also explain why the young girl went into those woods. O'Leary admitted that the entire story about the DJ had been fabricated. In reality, Laurel had arranged for Henry to meet her in the woods to buy illegal substances. She might have decided to bring Christie along under another pretext, possibly using the same story about the DJ and the cheerleading competition. According to a much darker version, Laurel may have brought Christie there at Henry's request, who planned to abuse her. But the girl put up a serious fight, as evidenced by the scratches and abrasions on her body, and the man killed her. As O'Leary dug deeper into the case, he discovered that in the meantime, Henry had committed other crimes, including arson, domestic violence, and abuse. There was another related incident, but Henry wasn't charged for it: the death of his wife, PM, in 1982. She had filed for divorce, and a month later she was found dead in her own apartment, where she still lived with Henry. The official cause of death was an overdose of sleeping pills, and the police found a suicide note indicating that the woman had done it herself. PM's relatives didn't believe this version and suspected that Henry had given her the sleeping pills. The strangest part of this story is that no packaging of sleeping pills was found in the apartment, while PM obviously couldn't have disposed of it after consuming such a large quantity of the substance. In 2010, the year the lawyer took on the case, Henry died of cancer at the age of 63. Despite this, O'Leary continued to work on the case and published a book compiling all the available information about Christie's murder. The publication of the book sparked a renewed wave of interest in the case, and Christie's relatives, along with other concerned individuals, began flooding the police department with requests to reopen the investigation. Additionally, several members of Henry's family were connected to the case. They revealed that the entire family knew perfectly well that Henry had killed the young girl, but chose to remain silent. One woman recounted that a few months before her 16th birthday, Henry gave her a car, and they went for a drive together. At one point, he asked her to pull over, got on top of her, and confessed that he was the one who killed Christie, detailing exactly what he had done. The woman said she couldn't believe him at the time because Henry had been drinking heavily, and she assumed he was just making up the story under the influence of alcohol. But when she read O'Leary's book, everything fell into place for her. This led to the reopening of the investigation into the murder in May 2014, which lasted for many months. Investigators re-examined all leads and evidence. Remarkably, in his confession to a relative, Henry admitted to abusing Christie. At the time, forensic experts found no evidence, but when the girl's clothes were re-examined using modern technology, traces of male sperm were found. Unfortunately, the samples were too small to conduct DNA tests. The investigation continued until the end of 2015, when the detectives held a press conference. 40 years after the murder, they finally announced that they had no doubt Henry was the one who committed the crime. Had he still been alive, they would have been able to secure a conviction. But with Henry deceased, there was no way to bring the case to court. The case was reclassified as solved, and the investigation was closed. Of course, while Henry was alive, Investigators couldn't be 100% certain of what happened, but they had a rough idea. It's likely that when Henry left home that day, he took the path behind the mall. It's possible that Laurel called him to buy marijuana, though this point remains unproven. Once there, Henry saw Christie alone and decided to assault her. He tied the girl's hands with a telephone cable and took her further into the woods, where she tried to resist. Christie managed to scratch and hit him in the face, after which Henry probably threw her to the ground and killed her with a piece of wood that was nearby. He then returned home and told his wife what had happened, and together they came up with a plan to cover it up. It's important to note that Laurel never told the truth all these years. It's possible that she had something to do with what happened, and maybe one day she'll reveal everything. During the press conference, the police also apologized to Christie's relatives for the negligence with which their predecessors had handled the case over the years. From the very first days, they had enough evidence to charge Henry with murder, but the investigators either overlooked or ignored it.